Most people think The Good Samaritan is a story about loving everyone. But what if I told you it's not about universal love at all? In fact, it's actually a story about in group loyalty, and it reveals Jesus' Jewish supremacist framework. The parable of the Good Samaritan is one of the most quoted stories in all of Christianity. It's plastered on hospitals, charities, and sermons as the ultimate picture of compassion. Ask most people what it means, and they'll tell you it's about loving everyone friend, stranger, even enemy. But here's the problem that's not what the story meant in its original setting. When Jesus told it, he wasn't laying down a universal ethic for humanity. He was answering a specific question inside a specific community: who counts as my neighbor? To get the story right, we have to peel it out of the modern slogan and drop it back into the first century world of Jewish rivalries, purity codes, and debates over covenant loyalty. Only then do we see what's really going on and why the story isn't about universal love at all, but about in group boundaries, shame, and supremacy. Let's get a little background for our conversation. Who were the Samaritans? When we hear Samaritan today, most people imagine an outsider, almost like a foreigner or a Gentile. But in the first century Jewish world, that's not what the word meant at all. The Samaritans were descendants of Israelites who had been left behind after the Assyrian conquest centuries earlier. They kept the Torah, practiced circumcision, and claimed to worship the God of Israel. But they had their own holy site on Mount Gerizim, not the Jerusalem temple. Over time, their community also included intermarriage with surrounding peoples. To Judeans, this made them religiously suspect and ethnically tainted. So, in Jewish eyes, Samaritans weren't pagans, they weren't atheists, they weren't Gentiles. They were the wrong kind of Jews, a despised cousin group, if you will. Think of it like a family feud that's gone on for centuries. That's what makes the parable sting in its original context. Jesus isn't praising a total outsider. He's telling a story where the most despised version of us behaves more faithfully than the elite version of us. This is why the parable doesn't point to universal love. It's not about welcoming the nations, it's about forcing his audience to admit that even the lowest rung of their own extended family might still act more like a true neighbor than the religious leaders at the top. The story of the Good Samaritan doesn't appear in a vacuum. It's told in response to a very specific question: who is my neighbor? That question itself reveals something important. In Jewish law, love your neighbor as yourself was already commanded, and I've done an entire video on what that actually meant. The debate was never whether to love your neighbor, but who counts as your neighbor. Was it just family, tribe, fellow Israelites? Jesus responds with a story that begins: a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Everyone listening would have assumed that the man was Jewish. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a Jewish route connecting two Jewish cities. So, from the very first sentence, the neighbor in question is one of their own. Here's how the story unfolds: a priest comes by, a representative of the religious elite. He passes. A Levite comes by, a respected religious worker. He also passes. Finally, a Samaritan comes by, a despised cousin considered lower class and impure. He stops to help. The punchline isn't that all people everywhere should be seen as neighbors. The punchline is that even this despised figure acted more neighborly toward a fellow Jew than your own religious leaders did. It's an internal critique aimed at shaming the elites and reinforcing solidarity among the Jews. In other words, Jesus uses the Samaritan not to expand the circle of neighbor love to the whole world, but to remind his audience that faithfulness isn't tied to social status. Even the lowest can fulfill the law better than the highest. So when people say the Good Samaritan is a parable about universal love, they miss the point. It's not a charter for global compassion. It's a call for Jews to take better care of Jews. When people today talk about Jesus, they often frame him as a universal teacher, someone who came to bring hope to all nations. But in the earliest sources, that's not the picture we get. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 24, Jesus says plainly, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. His mission wasn't about embracing humanity at large, it was about restoring and elevating Israel. Everything else flowed from that priority, from that ethic. That exclusivity shows up in other places too. Jesus regularly pronounced judgment on Jewish towns that rejected his message. Woe to you, Chorazin, and woe to you, Bethsaida, casting them as doomed because they refused the coming kingdom. And when a Canaanite woman begged him to heal her daughter, his response was brutal. It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. The children were Israel. Everyone else in his framework was an outsider, less than, dogs. Put together, this paints a clear picture. Jesus' program was not global inclusion, it was Jewish restoration and supremacy. His kingdom vision assumed that Israel would be vindicated, raised above the nations, and that those who resisted that order were unworthy of life in this age and the age to come. So when we read parables like the Good Samaritan, we can't overlay modern ideals of universal love onto them. We have to see them inside the larger framework, a movement aimed at Israel's renewal, not at humanity's liberation. But there's also an insult here, hiding in plain sight. The very title, The Good Samaritan, carries more insult than praise. To the original audience, the phrase would have sounded almost contradictory because Samaritan was already a slur in Judean culture. By calling this man good, the story doesn't elevate him. It frames him as the shocking exception to a despised rule. It's like a white supremacist telling a story and saying, even that half breed put you to shame. The point isn't to dignify the so called half breed, it's to humiliate the supposed purebloods by saying, look how low you've fallen if even they've outperformed you. In that sense, the Samaritan isn't the hero of the story. He's a prop. He's used as a tool to embarrass the elites, not as a model of inclusion. Translate this into modern terms, and you can feel how offensive it really is. Imagine a story titled The Good Mexican or The Good Black Person. The label itself would expose deep prejudice. It would imply that the group as a whole is inherently suspect, and that the storyteller's surprise at finding one who is good is meant as a rebuke to others, not as genuine respect. So when we hear the Good Samaritan and think it's about radical inclusion, we're missing the subtext by a mile. The story doesn't dissolve prejudice, it uses prejudice to drive the point home. When we peel back the layers of the Good Samaritan story, the popular interpretation starts to collapse. It's not a parable about embracing the whole world. It's not an ethic of radical inclusion. At its core, the story is about reinforcing boundaries within Israel. Jesus uses the figure of the Samaritan, the lowest rung of a despised in group, to shame the elites at the top. The Samaritan isn't held up as an equal, but as a mirror showing how far the priests and Levites had fallen short of their own law. What's striking is how later Christians retold the story. Over centuries, the parable was rebranded as a universal call to love everyone, everywhere. That retelling sanitized the exclusivity baked into the original context. It transformed an in house critique of Jewish elites into a sweeping moral slogan about compassion for all. But if we return to the first century world, we see the limits. Jesus' vision wasn't liberation for the oppressed or solidarity with outsiders. It was a supremacist framework, Israel's restoration and rule, with even the least inside the family able to shame the great into proper covenant behavior. So the Good Samaritan doesn't open the door to global love, it exposes how narrow the door actually was. When we look at Jesus' teaching as a whole, the pattern is consistent. This was never meant to be a wide open invitation to the world. It was always an in group call. Jesus himself said, narrow is the way that leads to life, and few there be that find it. That wasn't a vision of mass liberation. It was an expectation that most people would be left out. He even admitted that he spoke in riddles, parables, so that outsiders would not understand and so they would not repent. And if you need a reference, that's Mark chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, and Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 through 15. His teaching wasn't designed to include the masses, it was designed to guard the covenant, to keep the circle small, and to make sure that only the right insiders could recognize the message. So when Christians today retell the Good Samaritan as if it's about universal love, They're not just stretching the story, they're flipping its meaning. The real message is narrow, supremacist, and exclusionary at its finest. And the parable itself reveals the limits of Jesus' vision, a vision where boundaries were reinforced, outsiders were kept outside, and only a select few were considered worthy of life. Isn't that kind of the whole story? If there is a heaven and a hell, a God of universal love you do not have. Listen, if you're tired of narrow visions that keep people out, let's build something wider together. We're creating a people centric, progressive thinking, secular humanist community where everyone belongs, not just a chosen few. That's why we're launching Bridge City Global. And right now, the SoCal team is leading the way. I don't want to be offensive, but California is on fire. Here's what I want you to do today. Tap in using the link in the description. This is how you step into the community, whether you're local or across the world. If you're in Southern California or anywhere, register for the Rise event. The details are in the description. It's going to be a time of deprogramming, reprogramming, and transforming together. Don't miss it. And if you believe in this work and want to help us keep it moving, you can support through Patreon, PayPal, or grab one of our guides on Windows Shop. Every contribution keeps these conversations going further and farther. Finally, hit subscribe and share this video with one person who still thinks the Good Samaritan is about universal love. Help push this conversation out so that more people can see through the myths. Because the Good Samaritan wasn't about loving the world, but we are. Thank you for spending your time with me today, and until next time, keep rising.